The following is an unrehearsed interview with Loretta Hill York of Paducah, Kentucky, by John Marshall for the Kentucky Oral History Commission. The interview was conducted at the Marshall County Library in Benton, Kentucky on June the 27th, 1978 at approximately 1 p.m. Most of the interview concerns Marshall County history, specifically the Birmingham area of Marshall County. Hey, Mrs. York, you were talking to me the other day about your grandmother who used to live in what's now, or what was called Birmingham, which is underwater under the Kentucky Lake now. Can you give me a little bit of family history before we start? Can you tell me, for instance, who was your grandmother and your grandfather?
My grandmother, before she married, she was Cora Nanny, N-A-N-N-E-Y, and originally her family was from Missouri, but they came into Kentucky, or she did at the visit, and she married John Collie, and he was from out here, what is now known as Fair Dealing, is the adjoining farm to where Jonathan Elementary School is now. And when they married, which was in about 18 well, she was 18 years old when she married, and she was born in 1873. We have that down. And they moved down below Birmingham. It was behind the road, or off the road that went from Birmingham to Gibbersville, which is now all underwater. But you turned west off of that road, and you crossed a creek, and you went over, that was those creeks in that area. She was almost surrounded by creeks, or Little Bear, King Creek, and then not too far from what is known as Big Bear. And in that area, that was lowland mostly, and it was creek bottom land. And they bought a half portion of 320 acres that someone had bought, or they didn't buy really, they got it from the government to homestead it. And they did some clearing and built a home on there. And then later, she and my grandfather, John Collie, at a very young age, bought 160 acres of that. And the house that was on it was a log one room with a side room on it. And that's where they settled and tried to clear some more of the land and to farm some of what was already there. And for something like 2 years or so before he died, he was sick and she had to more or less take over. But in the meantime, 6 children were born to them, 5 daughters and 1 son. And when he was 30 years old, he died, and she was 28. So she was left a widow at 28, and she remained a widow till 98, which is when she died.
Can you tell me, just before we go any further, who, you said there were several daughters and a son.
Yes.
Can you tell me who you want to give me their names?
Yes,
and then who they became when they married?
All right. Isla Collie Nunley.
Would you spell that for me again?
I-L-A.
Right.
Nunley, N-U-N-L-E-Y.
Okay.
And the next one was Lillian Fields, F-I-E-L-D-S.
Okay.
And the next one was Layla Duncan.
How do you spell Layla?
L-A-L-A-H.
Okay.
And the next one was Ethel Goheen, E-T-H-E-L.
All right.
And Ruth Hill, which is my mother.
Okay. And there were no boys.
Oh, Willard, yes, one. Willard. He was the 3rd child. Help me get that.
Willard Collie.
Yes.
C-O-L-L-E-Y?
I-E.
C-O-L-L-I-E. All right, so there were 5 girls.
And 1 son.
And one son.
Mm-hmm.
And did they all live?
They were all born in this same log house I was talking about
Mhm.
over a period of about 10 or 11 years. When my mother, which was youngest child, was an infant, her father died. And my grandmother said in later years she was quite sure he had gallbladder or gallstones, but at that time that was an unheard of disease. It was referred to as indigestion, and he had several attacks. And finally, in the night, without anyone being around or with her other than the children, he became very ill and died. So she, of course, then was left on the farm with those children. She brought him back, which at that time was quite a distance, to this Fairdealan area, to the cemetery, the family cemetery, and buried him. And she even had to send someone, a neighbor on the horse, back up to that area to notify his family, which were his parents and brothers and sisters, that he had died and that she would be bringing him up there to bury him. And now this was in the year of 1901. And as I said, he was 30 years old because he was born in 1871, and he died in 1901.
When she buried him?
Yes. They brought him in a wagon up to Fairdealan.
Yeah. Do you know? Did your mother tell you if there were any sorts of precautions taken against the body deteriorating?
No, I think that presented a little bit of a problem because, as you know, probably the next day they brought him up there, and it was almost a day's journey from where they were in a wagon to bring his body up there. And I think they buried him that same day, but I wouldn't say for sure because it's possible, because she talked about how they had to bring other members of the family, locate some of them, which they couldn't all, because he was from a large family. There were 2 sets of children, and he was of the older Collie set. In other words, the great-grandfather Collie had 2 wives, and he had 7 children by the first and 8 by the second.
Hmm.
And several of the second set of children still live in Marshall County, and their descendants. Now, the older set of children were not as healthy and not as strong, and many of them died at a fairly young age.
Hmm.
Some of them even before marriage, and some after marriage, and none of them lived to be very old.
These are the Collies?
They're Collies, yes, of the first set.
Yeah.
The second set of Collies did live, the normal span of life, but the first set of children, most of them died before they raised their families.
Did your mother ever speculate as to why that might be?
My grandmother?
Your grandmother, I'm sorry.
No, she just said they were weakly constituted, was the word she used. And some of them had tuberculosis, but now her husband didn't. He died younger, but some of the others that lived a little longer. I know there was one brother and one sister that did, and that lived longer, and they died with old-fashioned TB, they called it. And they were, she said, referred to a weakly constituted family. And her daughters seemed to be too. She had a lot of problems, health problems with raising these children, and that leads me to tell you that she used to tell me how she did her own doctoring, and because a doctor was just not available. She might take the children in to a doctor, but a doctor, and most of her children were delivered by midwife, back there where they lived. But she said that she would go to town and get Hard Rock candy and whiskey, and then she would put other roots and plants and things, she would boil them and mix them for her medicines. And she continued to be a fairly good practical doctor too. She was strong on poultices, she called them. She'd make poultice out of different things and use flannel cloths. And after such things as Big Salve came in, she used that. But before that, she'd make up some of her own salves, or there would be some kind of a peddler that would come through once in a while that would have high-powered ointment, and she would stock up on it to use for treating the children and so on.
Do you know what else she put in these potions that she mixed?
She used to talk about mullein. She used mullein, and that's a plant,
Is there another name for that plant?
No, I think that,
They
well,
do.
I mean, botanically there may be,
Yeah,
but.
that's the only one you know.
She used the roots of that rather than that, and then there were some things that she used the berries, and I know she used a lot of wild cherry bark. Now for cough syrup, and she had a lot of that kind of problems with her girls, she boiled a cherry bark and a sugar syrup and made her own cough syrup. Of course, they're still doing it, Luden's and all the rest of them, but she did it her way. And so she created medicines like that.
Do you know, while we're talking about your grandmother's medical practice, which she had to carry on with since there were no doctors available, do you know what she did for things like whooping cough, what she did for things like warts?
She took for the whooping cough or any kind of cough, because she had a lot of bronchial trouble with her children, was this wild cherry bark. And she also fixed the Hard Rock candy and the whiskey for them. She gave them that. Although she was a very strong woman for abstaining from drink, she used it for medicinal purposes.
Yeah. What about for things like childhood diseases like chickenpox and measles?
She talked about a lot of bathing and, like I said, poultices, and probably some of them, she realized that she lived on that she may have been going against the condition rather than favoring it, because she said, like chickenpox, that she tried to keep the breaks in places from drying because they were uncomfortable and so on, and she probably prolonged the condition where people have learned not to. She used a lot of cornstarch for drying up sores and injured places. She was strong on that. Salt, she used salt for medicine too. And soda after it was available. And I don't know how long a soda was available, how far back it was available to her, but she used that quite a bit.
Did she ever mention any cures which we would now term superstitious?
Wart removing, yes. There was one woman in the neighborhood that was supposed to be able, if you went to her, to rub it and say some strange words, and the woman wasn't strange in any other way, but she was supposed to have had the power for removing warts.
Do you know why she was supposed to have had that power?
No, I don't even know
You've
how
never heard?
Yes, I barely remember her.
Do you?
She lived to be very old.
What was her name?
Mrs. Holland, Mrs. Marion Holland.
Marion Holland. And she lived around Birmingham?
Yes, in another direction, but she lived in the area.
Yeah. And this would have been in the 1920s, 30s?
Yes, that would have been later. That would have been, I'd say, yes, probably in the early 1920s, yes, when she carried some of her family to her.
Well, now, were there any other remedies that you remember that you might call superstitious besides wart removing?
No, I don't think so. I don't think she was a very practical sort of woman, and if other people were doing it, she wouldn't have been very likely to adopt that. She would be one that would think it had to sound practical, and also possibly see some results.
Yeah.
Now there were some roots and plants that she brewed for cathartics or laxatives, but I don't remember what they were.
You don't know what they were?
I don't know what they were, but she did use them.
Okay. Now,
she used black draught, and I don't know when that came on the market, but that's a leaf like.
It was a patent medicine, though, that
Yes,
was made up somewhere else
yes,
and then brought in. Yeah. Okay. Now, your grandmother, her name was Cora Collie, right? And she was widowed in about 1901.
Yes.
And she lived down here at Birmingham with 6 children. She was.
At that time, she lived quite a ways from Birmingham. You came from her farm, you crossed the creek, and you intercepted the road from Gibbersfield to Birmingham.
Okay. Now, which creek did you cross?
I think it was King's Creek, but I'm not sure. It would have been our Little Bear one.
Yeah.
She is between the creeks, and anyway she went, she had to cross a creek.
All right. And there was no bridge?
No bridge, no. And the creek that she crossed to get out most of the time when she went to Birmingham, which is mostly where she went. That's where she went to church, that's where she went for other needs, that's where she later moved. she would cross that creek just a short distance before she would come into the road, which was a public road from Gibbersville to Birmingham.
Just before that road?
Yes.
Okay.
That's the one that I referred to about the little episode when she was caught and had to ford the creek.
Tell me that story.
Okay, she took the $5 because 2.5 years after her husband died, the only son died at the age of 9. And she didn't really know what was wrong with him, but he died. And so when her husband died, they had a mare that they would produce a colt every year, and a mule colt they would produce so as a better work animal. Well, when her husband died, she had one mule that was 2 years old, which would be ready to break or to work, and then she had one that was 1 year old. So she waited till the next spring and sold the youngest one to pay for the burial and what little debt was involved in that. And then she kept the other one, and then the mare was bred to produce again. So, but the mare, in the meantime, had to be the farm animal and the transportation animal. So they had a buggy, and they would go into Birmingham, and it was a very lonely life out there for our widow and 6 daughters. And they were the type of people who wanted to socialize, and they particularly wanted to improve themselves. And so they went to things in town, to Birmingham, that they thought would be helpful, and they went to a little one-room school, 2.5 miles. They walked to that for their education.
What was the name of that?
Ball Knob.
Okay, thank you.
And they went to Birmingham to church. So on one occasion, they went into church on Sunday morning in the buggy, the 6 of them, and it was summertime, and they quite often would stop with friends or go with friends and eat dinner. Maybe they'd carry some of their food with them, and then they would eat with these friends and visit with them and find out what was going on. And a summer storm came up, and a severe rain, or heavy rain, and it made the creek fill. So, and also darkness came earlier that day, and they couldn't leave until the rains let up. So by the time they left, the friends, and these people's name was Harvey Culp, and he lived to be very old too, and I remember him, and his family lives out here around Vinesburg now. And she always spoke kindly of them because she was always welcome at their house. But anyway, they left there feeling they had to go home for the night. And when they got to the creek, it was up and it was dark. So she instructed the girls all where they would sit in the buggy, and she assured them that the old mare would be what they could depend on to get them across the water safely. And so everybody agreed. Well, she talked to the mare and directed her slightly by the lines, but mostly by talking to her. And she crossed the creek safely. And when she got over there, she counted heads, and one was missing. And some of the other girls said, yes, Ethel, which she would have been something like 8 or 9 years old then, got scared, and she jumped out. And she looked back across the creek, and she was standing on the bank where she had left from. And the other girls, none of them had told it, that none of them had spoken a word while they crossed. So then she told those 4 girls that she would have to go back across the creek, she and the mare, and get the other daughter, and for them to stay put. So the mare swam back across, part of it was swimming, and they did in the buggy, and got the other daughter and came on the other side. And she never mentioned reprimanding or punishing or the one for disrupting the schedule, and I doubt that she did. Because she was not the type of person that they respected her highly, and she didn't have to exercise as much discipline as we think of it now.
Mm-hmm. Excuse me. Do you know, for instance, how much flotation was involved in crossing that creek?
No, of course the creeks were fairly narrow. I've been across the creek, but not when it was full of water, but I would say it was something like the width of this room.
15 feet.
Yeah, 12 or 15.
12 or 15 feet.
I guess when you're out that way, it doesn't look as wide to you. I'd say 15 feet, yes.
15 feet, about the width of the creek.
Because usually where this was, there was a little bit of a roadway that went down the bank on each side, because people did go back and forth over it, and they wore it down some. But right away, when she would have started down that, she would have had to have started the floating
Mm-hmm.
because the buggy and the mare, as far as that goes.
Yeah, so I was thinking the mare had to
Yeah.
sort of support,
Yeah.
pull the buggy along as it was
did,
floating.
she did.
Yeah.
And they also said that they would be out sometime after, caught after dark, and she would relax the reins and just drop them down on the buggy, and she'd let the mare take them home.
Mm.
It would be too dark for her to see to direct the mare. It was just a dirt road. It wasn't a public road.
Mm.
And they only passed one house after they crossed the creek going to their place, and there were times when no one occupied that house, so sometimes they were the only ones over there. So finally, after staying there about 10 years, and the struggle was so great to survive there, and the older girls by that time had gone to this one-room school and graduated from it, which would have been 8th grade, supposedly. And at that time, if you could get away, could make it to Benton, you could take a teacher's test, and you could get a teacher's certificate, and then you could be a teacher. But the test was rather difficult and challenging. So the oldest daughter came to Benton and took the test and qualified to teach. So then the next daughter was hoping to do the same thing, and my grandmother debated a long time, and she decided that she needed to come into town to Birmingham, which was just a small village, of course, so the girls could have a better opportunity for going to school and so on. But in the meantime, they just, I don't know how she managed to even get some money, but she did, because other people used to tell us this, that when Widow Collie and her 5 daughters came to Birmingham to church on Sunday, that it was a sight to see. They would be in their buggy, and they all 6 would have on white, long, flowing dresses with a lot of lace and ruffles, and full-length white petticoats and half-length petticoats, and they were all starched and ironed into perfection. And she said that she ironed most of the time on the open coals with flat iron, and if she got any of the soot on a garment when she was wet, she just took it and re-washed it. And when she was doing them up, as she called it, she took her cold starch to the line with her and starched them in that, so they'd be sure to have plenty of starch in them, and then they ironed them that way.
Did she? She made all of the clothes for the girls.
She made all their clothes,
Uh-huh.
and she said not very often that she never had very much oil for her lamps, so she tried to do this kind of work in the daylight as much as she could. And even her ironing, though, she said she only had 2 windows in the house, so she didn't have much light any time, except the firelight. Of course, in summer that was awfully hot. She said she'd iron sometimes on her cook stove in the summer. And so she tried to do her sewing, but she did a lot of this sewing by hand, so she could sit out in the yard and do it. And she did very intricate stitches, because I have some of her quilts and things, and
Yeah.
she did that. And all the trim and everything that she put on their garments, which she did that by hand. And she farmed creek bottom land, so it wouldn't be so she could go and farm early of a morning. So she would do these other things early of a morning, and then up in the day, of course that meant the heat of the day, she took to the fields.
And let me have a couple of questions here. Did she ever make, as far as you know, did she ever make any of the cloth?
No, she didn't.
She bought that in Birmingham.
The mother-in-law of hers, which her father's mother, had a loom and a spinning wheel, and she did a lot of that. And she had some things, but it's mostly bed clothing. It was made by her, but their clothing was made from, well, it was bleached or unbleached muslin and nansuk, as she called it. She considered that, a real treat to have nansuk, which was a finer fiber.
Yeah.
And so on. And she bought that in Birmingham. They had stores that came in by boat to Birmingham. The stores carried materials in the early 1900s.
Okay. Now, she farmed this creek bottom land
Yes.
on her own with
Yes.
the help of the 5 girls
Uh-huh.
for about 9 years.
Yes, that's right.
And can you tell me what sort of activities she was engaged
She
in?
raised a little tobacco. That was her only money crop, nearly, was to raise some tobacco. And then she raised corn, of course, to feed her milk cow and her mare and her colts, whatever it was. And she'd sell off. She never couldn't break into these mules, so when they were, she'd keep them 2 years, and then she'd sell them to some man who could break them and make work animals out of them. And of course she got a little money from that. And then the tobacco crop, and most of the time she just sold that tobacco crop to some man, which meant she probably had to take a discount, but then he would take it and with his to market. But there was a tobacco plant in Birmingham at that time.
Well, there was.
Yes, it was the Martin Tobacco Company.
In Birmingham.
Mm-hmm. And they prepared it in hogsheads and put it on the boats and sent it to Paducah. So she sold it to a neighboring farmer, and he in turn sold it to the Martin Tobacco Company, and then they in turn shipped it to Paducah.
Did any of the neighboring farmers help her raise her crops?
No, not very much. The year he died, her husband died, they came in and took and planted her crop. He died early enough the year he wasn't into it. They put her crop out, and once or twice she said in a very tight situation they did, but she often was impressed with a lot of charitable things that was done in later years. It was not done then. Everybody was so struggling that she said, except in death or serious illness, people didn't look after each other. Mm-hmm. And she is a very independent soul, so I know she never asked anybody. So she had very little help on things like that.
Well, what other things did she raise to supply for the family, for instance?
Well, she just raised all their vegetables that she could, beans and potatoes, and there was an orchard on that. The people who had bought this and homesteaded it put out a fairly good apple orchard and a few peach trees. And even as late as that I can remember, like in the 1920s, we'd get reports from someone that there was a good apple crop down there, and we would take off down there and and cut our way into it grown up so to the orchard, and they were rather unusual the type of apples. There were lots of varieties of apples in there, and she dried lots of fruit. She picked blackberries. Now that's one of the money crops. Every summer she and the girls picked blackberries and carried them by buggy to Birmingham, and they never got more than 10 cents a gallon for them. And she said one summer when there was a good season, they picked 300 gallons of blackberries and hauled them to Birmingham and sold them for 10 cents a gallon. And if you ever pick blackberries, that's a lot of work to pick 300 gallons. And she had one woman who bought from her. She used to tell this, and not with bitterness, but and this woman, they would pick them in a measure and put them in tubs and then carry them down. So this woman wouldn't accept their measure. She'd have them to measure them again, which meant she gained some because, they were soft and they were packed down, and yet she still just paid them 10 cents a gallon. And this was someone who had very good circumstances from that time and actually took advantage of her situation.
Now, did your grandmother did they have any animals? Did she raise?
Well, she had milk cows, yes.
Milk cows.
Yeah, milk cow. And once in a while she would get some farmer to butcher a calf for her on the shares. And she'd get part of the meat. And she dried some of that, and she canned some of it. And she would have it done. Also a hog. She usually kept some pork, some hog to kill for that while she's on the farm. And she and the girls would catch the hog and manage to and carry it to another farm family when they would be butchering hogs, where they'd be congregated, and they would fix hers for her. But she did a lot of the cutting up for hers and other people too, and renting the lard and so on, in return for what they handling hers. And then when she decided to move to Birmingham, there was no sale for her property, that farm. And the only way she felt she could go to Birmingham was to buy a home, a house and lot. So she got a chance to sell enough timber off of that for railroad ties. There was also a tie company in Birmingham, and they bought railroad ties, and they shipped them by boat out of there. So she sold enough ties to pay most of what it took to buy a house and lot in Birmingham, and she bought in Birmingham in 1910.
Do you, first of all, let me establish, how far was her farm from Birmingham? How
The way
long?
she had to go was about 7 or 8 miles. There were 2 ways she could go, but there was both of them is about the same distance the way she went.
7 or 8 miles.
Uh-huh.
And how long would that take her? Do you know?
Well, that would have taken, I'd say, 2 hours.
But she never did tell you how long.
No, I'm not sure.
Uh-huh. One other thing, did she just walk out of this property and leave it as it was?
Yes, she did. She just had to leave it after she sold that timber off of it, and it had some good farming. And she left it in 1910, and it stayed right there like that until 1940, and TVA bought it.
And it was her
Still in
property
her-
until
in
1940.
30 years it sat there, I'd say idle. There were a few times when some neighboring farmers would raise some corn in the bottom, and they'd bring her like 2 or 3 wagon loads of corn to Birmingham, because when she moved to Birmingham, she took the old mare, Old Belle, the one that had been so faithful for them. She moved her to town with her. She had no use for her, but they moved her and kept her till she died. And she took the mare and also some chickens with her, and she kept chickens for a long, long time, so she fed the corn at the farmers if they brought her a share. But she was not able, after later years, to pay the taxes on that land, and by that time she had acquired 5 son-in-laws, so 3 of them paid the taxes just to keep it from resorting back to the county. So then when TVA did buy it, they were refunded their tax money, and then she got the money for the farm, as well as the house and lot that she'd been living in all these years at Birmingham.
Now, this the property that she left on the farm. There was a log house.
Yes.
Now that wasn't built by her husband, though, was it?
No, just one other family. It was the Lilly family.
The Lilly family.
Lilly.
Uh-huh. They had been there previously, and
They were the ones that homesteaded this.
in the 50s.
Well, yes, I'd say about that.
Yeah.
Probably.
And they'd built this log structure, and there was what else? Do you know what other buildings were on that farm?
There was just a little what they call smokehouse, where they put the meat and canned food and things like that. And that, when I would go back down there, which was several years later, that's some of the buildings that were there. And this sat up on a little knoll, the house did, and the orchard ran off down the slope from the back of that. And when she moved to Birmingham, she took up several sprouts of peaches and some apples, and transplanted them, because they were not like trees are now. They would grow that way on the lot where she moved to Birmingham. So until she left there in 1940, she had nice peaches all the time. And they were not as disease prone as they are now, because they were of a different variety. She also had brought plums, and she had a little plum thicket there on the lot in town.
In Birmingham.
And she brought all of those sprouts from that farm.
Do you know if she had to move herself, or if someone helped her?
No, someone would have had to. I don't believe she and the girls could have moved. Probably she got someone with wagon and team, because she mostly had a 1-horse wagon. I mean, even the farming she did just this mare, and she had it converted from a 2-horse wagon to a 1-horse wagon.
Well, the farm that she left, TVA bought it years 1940, I think you said.
Yes.
How far was that from the Tennessee River?
Do
you have any idea?
Well, see, it isn't underwater now, but the lowland is, the creek land is. Well, it was something like 2 or 2.5 miles from the river itself. But it was after the lake was impounded, and where the creeks were, where they came out, it was very close to the water. It's right below where Moore's Camp is now.
Yeah, but when she was farming it, and when
I'd say 2.5 miles from the river.
The house from the river.
But now Birmingham was right on the river.
Yeah.
See,
right.
But the farm was about 2.5 miles from the river, and it was almost directly from the river, going east of the river, east of the Tennessee River. West of it, I'm saying,
Yeah,
right,
west.
west of Tennessee River, yes.
Due west from it.
That's right.
So they just struck out east and they would hit the river after about
That's
2.5
right,
miles.
That's right, uh-huh.
I see. And it was on a knoll.
Yes.
Did you ever hear anybody mention that that house, that area, was ever threatened by floods?
No, her bottoms would flood, and sometimes she failed crops completely. That's one of the reasons her farm couldn't be rented out much, is because it's unpredictable about whether it would be flooded or not.
Uh-huh.
The farmland.
Yeah. How much of her land was cleared? Do you have any idea?
Well,
She had 167 acres, right?
she had about 160 acres, because there were
160.
3 20-acre tracts of the way they did them, and
Yeah.
she had about half one. Well, I would say probably 35 or 40 acres
Were cleared.
was cleared.
Mhm.
The other, some of it was rough growth, but it was growth anyway.
Yeah.
And some of it was good woodland. See, that's fairly good woodland.
Yeah.
And by the time TVA bought it, it was all grown up. There was no
Yeah.
open.
The house had fallen down?
Yes, we went down there just about the time this first man that bought and started building there on the site, and there were little blocks or rocks. There were, is what the foundation was just rocks that the logs were laid on.
Uh-huh.
And the cistern was still obvious there, and that would have been in about 1950, I guess, when we went back down there.
Yeah.
They
Now
were building a nice home there.
Now there is a home there now.
Yes.
Right.
uh-huh.
Now, can you tell me who owns that home now?
I don't know who owns it now. The man that built the first house was named Goose, and he
Goose.
was from Louisville.
From Louisville.
Mhm.
Okay.
But I don't know. It's changed hands several times,
Uh-huh.
and I really don't know who owns it now.
Yeah, but it's the same home on a knoll.
Yes.
And how far would it be from the lake now?
It's right at the lake.
Right on the
now,
lake.
uh-huh.
Yeah. Do you have any idea how much your grandmother eventually got for the 160 acres from TVA in 1940?
No, the records would show, but not very much.
Uh-huh.
And what would be, I was, the best I remember, the man who bought that site for a lake home paid nearly as much for that as she got for the
Entire acreage?
entire acreage, yes.
Uh-huh. Okay. Now, you've already mentioned that there was a tie company in Birmingham,
Mhm.
and that Birmingham was right on the river, and it was sort of a shipping port.
Yes.
It was probably a pretty good growth area.
Yes, it was.
Can we?
Tobacco and timber were the two big products that were shipped up down there.
What sort of tobacco was it?
Dark fired. tobacco.
Never burley?
No.
Okay.
Strictly dark fired.
Uh-huh. And you know what the timber was used for mostly?
Well, for building and then for railroad ties.
Yeah. Still the big tie industry. Okay.
Yes.
Now, can you remember any other businesses in Birmingham
Oh.
that you know of?
Oh yes, there was what you call my one of the son-in-laws had a department store, and had fairly well, it was for that day and time. It was a good stock of goods. So you had dry goods and packaged food and light hardware and so on. And later he had a drugstore there. He sold to the TVA in 1940, a drugstore. But
What was the name of the dry goods store?
Duncan's, Cleve Duncan.
And what about the drugstore? Same?
Same.
Uh-huh,
Duncan's
Duncan's.
drugstore.
Uh-huh. Can you remember any other buildings that were there? Any other businesses?
Yeah, well, yes. This Lilly, Mr. Jim Lilly had also a department or store, general store, and then he carried more groceries than the Duncan store did, and less dry goods.
Mhm.
And he had a candy counter, and I remember the candy counter. I thought it was big, but it wasn't, then. And he had a lot of variety of candy,
Mhm.
small pieces and things like that. Like you could even get several pieces for a penny.
Mm.
And at the back of his store was the doctor's office, and a door opened out the back way, and that was the only doctor in town.
Mhm.
And I was small, I think about 11 years old. I had the toothache in one of my jaw teeth, and they carried me down there to the doctor. We didn't have a dentist, and he took his chair out of the office and set it out there on the sidewalk, but it was gravel sidewalk, and pulled my tooth. And I still don't have one there.
Do you remember the doctor's name?
Dr. Clayton.
Clayton. He was the only doctor in
Yes, and
Birmingham?
before him it was Dr. Stone,
Stone.
and he was there for many, many years.
Yeah.
And
Can you remember any other businesses? Was there a hotel?
yes, at one time there was a hotel, and it was called a drummer's hotel. And a drummer was a salesman.
Uh-huh.
And the Farleys operated it. Their name was Farley. Now I don't remember it, but
Yeah.
this has been handed to me. But I know where it was.
Yeah.
And yes, I remember it as a house. It was converted later into it was a 2-story building,
Uh-huh.
and there were not very many 2-story houses in Birmingham, very few. And that one raised a question, I think, in my mind, and that's what they told me it was. It was real plain structure, but it was 2-story.
Mhm.
And they said that was a drummer's hotel, and that the Farley family used to operate it.
All right.
And the salesmen would come into the area, and they'd hit other little towns like Gibbertsville, and even just country stores or right there. And there was also a livery stable that was attached to it. And right now the names don't come to me, but I've heard them talk about who operated the livery stables, but I don't remember.
Was
who
it a
they were.
blacksmith too?
Yes, possibly, yes.
But you don't know for sure.
No, now when it was a blacksmith there that I remember, which was just really blacksmithing, the name was Bill Goheen that operated that.
Uh-huh.
And but when it was a combination livery stable, I don't remember it,
Yeah.
but I know where it was, and I've heard them talk about it.
How far was Birmingham from the present-day county seat, Benton?
About 14, 15 miles.
14 miles, 15 miles.
It's
Okay.
what is now Highway 58,
Uh-huh.
but it was a different road, and it
Yeah.
went differently. It came in to Benton.
Okay.
Oh, another thing that impressed me about that was, I said that this daughter went to took the test and got a certificate. Well, after she had taught a year or two, she wanted to go and further her education. So Bowling Green was called a 2-year normal school, and she left Birmingham. And I don't know, she went by boat to Paducah, and then I think she got a train then to Bowling Green. And she went to school for a term. And her mother only heard from her once during that time. And while she was there, she had acute appendicitis and was operated on and recovered without her mother knowing it, because they didn't have any communication. There were no telephones, and the mail was difficult too. They had mail service, but evidently she didn't make that extra effort or whatever. So she went to Bowling Green, and then by that time a third daughter had done the same, taken the certificate, and she taught a school. So then she went to Bowling Green about 3 years later, and that was after my grandmother moved to Birmingham. Well, after she moved to Birmingham, then she had to make a living. See, we've taken her off the farm where
Right,
she was
she's in
making a living,
Birmingham.
and she's Birmingham. All right, she took in washing for people, and one of the things she did quite a bit of was to make burial clothes, and she laid out a lot of people. But unfortunately, after she lived there a little while, several of them were her friends and church people, and it was a little difficult to make charges.
Yeah.
But sometimes people just gave her favors or things,
Yeah.
but sometimes they paid her too. But she also did sewing for people, and she did washing and ironing.
Can you tell me if she told you about the burial customs, the practices? What did she have to do to lay them out?
Yes, she also, being a widow and free as she was, and being a person of this nature, she often attended people when they were sick, in their last illnesses, because people would come from quite a ways to have her come and help them with some of their sick. And she sometimes would just stay around, and knowing that they were going to die soon, and they would even request her to, so that she could lay them out. And she bathed them and dressed them, and talked about used to talk about what bad condition some of them were in when they died, because of course there wasn't anything to help carry them through or to like intravenous feeding or anything like that. And she often referred to the condition and that how difficult it was to make them look like who they were, because see, she was actually performing a embalmer, or not an embalmer, but a funeral director's job. And there was a hardware store there. It was operated by a Mr. Benjamin Smith, and he sold caskets, and they were wooden caskets, and some of them were so very plain that they were just lined with well, something like muslin or something like that, and some families would prefer to have more than that, and so sometimes she added more decoration to the interior of caskets.
Do you know if there was any sort of why is it called laying out?
Well, they laid them out on the bed, you know.
On the bed?
Yeah, because see, they would take everything off, and usually take them off of the sick bed, maybe into a better place, like a couch or something like that, and wash them and start over and with the burial clothes. And sometimes she just wrapped them up in a sheet or something, and she went home and made the burial clothes, and came back later and put them on them. And there some of them would have fairly good clothes, but they wouldn't be appropriate for a burial, and people had, as you know, strong feelings about that. So she'd take something they had home and rework it to make it appropriate for burial.
Was there any mention of putting coins in the eyes?
Well, I've heard people mention that. I don't know that she did,
Not
but
your
I've heard.
grandmother.
I don't know that I've heard her talk about it.
Okay.
And but I'm sure she did something like that.
Do you have any idea how much a casket cost?
Well, it seems to me like that they were something like $15 of that I've heard her say about something like that. But see, that was quite a bit of money.
Yeah, right.
Now that would have been after she moved to Birmingham. I don't know what it would have been when she buried her husband. I just don't know.
Well, she had to sell a horse to pay for it.
Yeah, she did, because there was what was involved in that.
Yeah.
She sold to pay her debt. So.
Yeah. Now, after your grandmother moved to Birmingham, and she was taking and washing, and she there was also working as a sort of a mortician, I suppose.
Yes,
How else did she get along? What else did she do?
Well, by that time, some of the daughters, you see, like I said, they were teaching in school, and they began to help her, because she worked real hard in her earlier life, and she took the attitude that I think a lot of times people did have, and that was that she thought she was old before she really was old. I would say that at the time she was 50 years old, she thought of herself as an old woman, although she lived to be 98.
Yeah.
And as far as I can remember, and my mother was her youngest child, and I was my mother's oldest child, I thought of her as an old woman. She was a very nice looking woman, and she took very good care of herself, her appearance and everything, but she just more or less, when she got the girls, and the others, the young ones, married real young. Now these older ones got their education, they didn't marry as young. And the young ones, the last ones, married younger. So they began to help her, and the ones that were teaching, and they helped with the other girls. I remember that they talked about that one of the first things Aunt Isla did after she taught school was she bought herself a blue serge suit, and they have pictures of her, you know, in that. And then she bought the other daughter that was going to go away to school next a blue serge suit. And then they interned at that. And then as the girls married and all, my grandmother would go into the homes and help with the children, and especially in illnesses and so on. And then they'd load her up with food to take back. And the son-in-laws cut her wood. She heated with wood. She always heated with wood. She wanted to heat with wood even after we had electricity. In fact, she fell and broke her arm when she was 88 because she lived out there by me, and she wanted to...
Where was that?
Out here on the highway going out of Benton.
North?
Yes, north.
Okay.
And she lived in a little two-room house next to me, and Mother and Daddy, which of course that was her daughter, Aunt, lived across the road, and another lived the other side. Well, she was very adventurous and was in good health, really. And so she insisted after she had electric heaters that she just wasn't comfortable without a wood stove. So they got her a wood stove and flew in the little 2-room house and got wood for her. And so she wanted, when she put her stove up that boss, she kept wanting it polished, and none of us got around to it as soon as she wanted us to. So one day we all went shopping in Paducah, and she caught us going. She knew we would scold her if she did it, if we caught her doing it. So she was polishing her stove, and she thought it looked better if she polished the pipe. So she stood in the chair to polish the pipe and fell and broke her arm. And when we got back, a neighbor had brought her into Benton, and they'd set her arm, and they had already brought her back home. And she was disappointed because she didn't get to go to the hospital. Everybody else, her daughters were sick a lot in the hospital, and they all had surgery quite a few times. She lived to be 98, never had surgery, and never was in the hospital except that last week before she died. And she really wanted to. And she just felt left out. And she threatened every once in a while to get on the bus and go to Paducah and enter the hospital when she'd be what she called ailing, you know, because everybody else had to go to the hospital and she didn't get to. So when she had her arm set, well, she didn't have to go to the hospital, and she came home and had very little problems with it.
Did she take any patent medicines, or did she make any of her own remedies?
Yeah, she was inclined to take patent medicine right up till she died, because she wouldn't be real sick to go to the doctors, and if she did, they didn't give her very much. And she's like a lot of old people. She wanted to take medicine, felt like she should. She didn't feel up to par, but.
What did she take, you know?
Well, she'd take any kind of laxative she could get, almost, and she took what she called tonics. She'd hear advertised, you know, on radio and TV, these revibrating tonics, and she'd send to the drugstore and get them and take them. Do you remember your mother ever talking about having spring tonics, and did you ever have spring tonics? No, I don't know. My grandmother did, because her girls had typhoid fever back when they lived at Birmingham. That's when my mother was about 13 or 14 years old, which would have been, because she was 10 when they moved to Birmingham, because she was a baby when her father died, and they moved in 1910, so she'd have been 9 years old. Well, after they moved down there, I think she was about 14. That would have been about 1914. Right. She had typhoid fever, and I think one or two of the others did. And she was very ill for a long time, and all of her hair fell out and everything, and she wasted away to just nearly nothing. And they had some of those kind of things, and then she would give tonics to them to try to build them back. She gave them, well, I thought it was some kind of oil. Not a castor oil type. No. And it had something else in it that was supposed to be good. A cod liver oil. Oh. Yeah, cod liver oil. That was a big thing when they were, you know, after they got a little older, for a builder. And of course, then she lived at Birmingham, and they had a doctor, and she got prescribed medicine at that time. They didn't prescribe either; they gave it to you. Right. Right. So. When did she move from Birmingham? In 1942. When TVA dispossessed us. Yeah. And where did she move then? Out here, north of Benton, and close to where all of us were. 641? Yeah. Okay. When TVA dispossessed all the people in there, do you remember what your grandmother thought about that? Well, she objected. I mean, I wouldn't say she objected. Because she was getting paid for her property, and you know, especially that she had a little different situation from some people. She was going to realize something out of that farm that she never had realized anything out. But she hated the breaking up and all, and she lived on the same block with the church, and the Birmingham Baptist Church, and that had been a haven for her by that time 30 years, and her daughters had grown up and all there, and close ties and friends and everything, and she was very regretful about that. She must have been about 70, over 75 when she had to move. Well, she was born in 73, and she moved in about 43. 70. 27. Yeah, she was 67 or something like that. Yeah. So, and were a lot of the people
angry, upset, frustrated? Or were most of them sort of saying, well, I'm getting some money out of this?
Some were and some were not. Now take her $5. They all still live there, and they were all bought out as a result of this. We lived a mile and a half out, but nevertheless we were we were borderline. We had to be bought out. My family didn't mind too much, and we felt like it might be we would improve from it, which we did. And two of the others did, but then there were two of them that took it very hard, and one of them had to be just forced out, and her husband just took it so hard that he lost his health. He went into a depression, and it took 3 or 4 years before he really recovered from it. They moved out here, but it was called Scale, and he wouldn't accept. Finally, after they condemned some of his farmland, and they put the money in escrow because he wouldn't accept the money. He just died, well, I guess about 12 years or so ago, and that money stayed in escrow till after he died, because he never would accept it. For the house and lot where they lived, because my aunt's name was on that, and she insisted they do it, they did. But for land that he had inherited from the Gaheen family, he refused the money. And he was an extreme in that respect, and then of course there were some that were glad to, and then there were those that were in between.
What was the population of Birmingham when
the town itself, I think about between 350 and 400, but it was fairly thickly settled for that day and time, or in the 30s and 40s, around the town. Like out where we lived, most everybody had a house, a neighbor that was within what we call hollering distance of each other.
What about when your grandmother was living on her own? How far away was her nearest neighbor?
When she's down at the farm? Oh, no way she could arouse a neighbor no matter what happened. If her house had burned or anything, it would just been never who was there. Nobody lived close enough. The Cox family was the closest, Clifton Cox, and you had to cross, they called it a branch, but it was almost like a creek between her house and theirs.
And how far would that have been, a mile or so?
3/4 or a mile, 3/4 a mile, and they moved away at one time to closer to his daddy's or somewhere to maybe to farm better or something, and at one time before she moved away there wasn't even anyone in that house, so that meant she really was back there by herself. The girls all thought that she never was really afraid of anything. She later said she was not afraid much, but there were times when she feared for their safety in some ways, but she didn't really, I guess she just couldn't.
No. Did things, what would have frightened her?
She said the thing that frightened her most was when the children were sick and she was back there by herself. Because see, she lost a husband and a son both that way.
Right.
They were sick and the children were small. She took care of that illness of her husband and then had to see him die young like that. And then the same way with 2.5 years later, her little boy, grown boy.
And she never mentioned a fear of animals or snakes or anything like that?
Or other people either.
No.
I don't think she would have been afraid of anybody else. She would have attempted to defend it herself and her children, even with someone else.
Did she have a gun?
No, I don't think so.
Not as far as you know.
She might have when she lived down there, but I don't think so, because I don't think she killed rabbits or anything like that. And some people did, to eat, but I don't think she did.
She was she noted as a pretty good cook?
No, she wasn't. Not even in later years, because you see, she worked to make a living and for survival.
Right.
And she wouldn't have been.
Didn't have enough time.
No, now some of the people she worked for when she moved to Birmingham, that she did their washing and ironing and their sewing, they would have been people that did good cooking, whereas she was doing the laborious type thing.
When you were talking before about on the Sundays when Widow Collie and her 5 girls would come into church in the white, do you have any idea, did she ever tell you what they wore most of the time around the farm? What sort of clothing?
We have quite a few pictures. I often wondered how in the world in that time that she managed to get the kind of pictures she has. We have a very enlarged picture of her husband who died, see, when he was 30, and of her, of the two of them together. And also, although she had them enlarged after they died, but she had good pictures of them. We have some 10 times.
Yeah.
And I still am amazed. I don't know how she left things like that. There were only a few of us grandchildren, but the 3 of us got picture frames that we prized very highly that were hers, and as well as some of the pictures that I have often wondered how she managed to get them. And to hold on to them. And I have a bowl, a hand-painted bowl, china bowl, that she said her husband went to Gibbersville on business, something about selling tobacco crop or something, and he wanted to bring her something back, and he brought that bowl to her, and it's a beautiful bowl.
Mm-hmm.
And they called it, just ready to say, it was what we call fruit cocktail bowl, but ambrosia. They called it ambrosia,
Mm-hmm.
and it was called an ambrosia bowl, and that was for special occasions.
Your grandmother died in 1978.
71.
71, and she was 98 years old.
That's right. And during probably from the time she was in her 60s, because maybe of this past experience, she felt that she wanted to be sure to have clothes to be buried in, so she put in her trunk underclothes and hose particularly to be buried in. And several outfits of that deteriorated and had to be thrown away, and more put in because she lived to be 98. But there were clothes in that trunk when she died that she had planned for us to put on her when she died. We had to take her to a nursing home in the last year, but even the day before I brought her